There is a country in the world where a nurse, a teacher, and a firefighter, 3 people doing the jobs society cannot function without, cannot afford to live in the city where they work, where young people with university degrees and full-time jobs are sharing bedrooms with strangers in their 30s because there is no other option, where an entire generation has quietly accepted that the thing their parents took for granted, owning a home, is simply not available to them. That country is Canada, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, a country sitting on more land than almost anywhere else in the world, a country that not long ago knew exactly how to house its people, and then chose to stop. This isn't a story about bad luck. It isn't a story about a housing market that got out of control. It is a story about decisions. Deliberate, documented, conscious decisions made by governments over decades that systematically dismantled every protection ordinary Canadians had against being priced out of their own country. I'm Malcolm. Welcome to History Meets Economics, the channel where we trace the decisions that shape the world you're living in right now. Because history isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's in your rent payment. It's in the listing you can't afford. It's in the future you're trying to build on a foundation that someone else quietly pulled out from under you. Hit subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. And if this is your life, if you've been priced out, pushed out, or you've simply given up, drop a comment. Tell us where you are and what it's cost you. Because what we're talking about today is not a policy debate. It is people's lives. Let's get into it. To understand how Canada destroyed its housing market, you first need to understand that it once had one of the best in the world. After World War II, Canada made a promise to the men and women who had sacrificed everything for this country. It was a simple promise. Come home, we'll help you build a life. And it kept that promise. The federal government didn't just talk about housing, it built it. It set up institutions, published free architectural blueprints, made mortgages affordable, and partnered with cities to create homes for people the private market would never bother with. For decades, Canada was producing hundreds of thousands of new homes every single year. Social housing, cooperative housing, affordable housing, a whole ecosystem of shelter that existed completely outside the profit motive. This was Canada operating at its best. A country that looked at housing not as a commodity to be traded, but as a foundation without which nothing else in a person's life can work. And then, in 1993, the federal government made the first and most consequential decision in this story. It walked away. Decision 1, the abandonment. No crisis triggered it. No war. No economic catastrophe. Just a budget decision. In 1993, the federal government ended all new funding for social housing construction. After 40 years of building, Ottawa simply stopped. The political argument was clean and simple. Let the private market handle it. Government had done enough. The market would provide. Provinces were expected to pick up the slack. Almost none of them did. And so tens of thousands of homes that would have been built every single year. Homes that existed outside the market. Homes whose rents didn't rise because a landlord wanted a profit. Homes that working people could actually afford simply never got built. Year after year after year. For 30 years. Think about what 30 years of not building looks like. Think about the families who needed those homes. Think about the pressure that quietly, invisibly built up in every rental market in every city in Canada as the population kept growing and the affordable housing stock stayed frozen in time. Canada didn't just stop solving the housing problem in 1993. It guaranteed it. Decision 2, the demand explosion. With the government gone from the business of building, housing in Canada was now entirely in the hands of the private market, and the private market responded the way it always does, by following the money. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, interest rates were falling, and when money is cheap to borrow, people borrow it to buy homes. Prices started climbing, slowly at first, then steadily, then confidently. For homeowners, this felt like success. Their houses were gaining value, their net worth was growing, the system seemed to be working. For anyone who didn't already own a home, it felt like a door closing, slowly, then faster. And then in 2006, instead of addressing any of this, the federal government did something extraordinary. It threw fuel on the fire. Ottawa decided that Canadians could now buy a home with $0 down. Nothing. No savings required. And they could stretch that mortgage over 40 years, nearly a full working lifetime. What that meant in practice was simple. Millions of people who couldn't afford to enter the housing market suddenly could. All at once. All competing for the same limited supply of homes. Prices didn't just rise after that, they surged. Because that's what happens when you flood a market with demand without doing anything to to increase supply. Decision 3, the investment trap. Here is where the story gets darker. For most of human history, a house was a place to live. You bought it, you lived in it. Maybe one day your kids inherited it. It was a home, not a financial instrument. Canada changed that. Through the 2000s, and especially the 2010s, as interest rates stayed historically low and government bonds paid almost nothing, investors started looking for somewhere to put their money. And in Canada, real estate was delivering returns that almost nothing else could match. So they poured in. Investment companies, real estate trusts, private landlords buying their second, third, fourth property. In province after province, research began to show the same thing. 1 in every 5 homes was being held as an investment rather than lived in as someone's primary residence. 1 in 5. Walk down a residential street in a Canadian city and do that math. Every 5th home, not a family inside it. An asset on someone's balance sheet. And as investors bought up everything they could get their hands on, ordinary Canadians found themselves in bidding wars they couldn't win against people who weren't even planning to move in. Housing had become a game, and the game was rigged in favor of people who already had money. Decision 4, the locked door. But there's something even more structural underneath all of this, something most people never even think about. For decades, across almost every Canadian city, the law said that most residential land could only ever hold one thing, one house, one detached, single-family home per lot. No exceptions. Not a duplex. Not a small apartment building. Not even a garage suite in the backyard. One house. In a country the size of Canada, in cities that were growing year after year, this was an economic time bomb. Because if the law says a city can only ever have a certain number of homes, and the city keeps growing, prices have only one direction to go. And here is the most infuriating part of this. The people who owned those single-family homes knew exactly what new housing supply would do to their property values. It would bring them down. And they voted, consistently, loudly, reliably, against any attempt to change the rules. Against apartments, against duplexes, against density, against anything that might mean their neighborhood looked different and their house was worth less. Politicians listened, because homeowners vote. And so, the door stayed locked, supply stayed choked, and prices kept climbing. Decision 5, the accelerant. Then March 2020 arrived, and every pressure that had been quietly building for 30 years was suddenly lit on fire. COVID-19 shut down the country. The Bank of Canada responded by slashing interest rates to the lowest level in Canadian history. Mortgage rates fell below 2%. When you can borrow money at a rate lower than inflation, you're essentially being paid to borrow. The signal to the housing market couldn't have been louder. Prices didn't just rise, they lost all contact with reality. In a single year, Canadian home prices jumped over 26%, the fastest pace ever recorded. Bidding wars broke out in cities that had never seen them. People were offering hundreds of thousands over asking, waiving inspections, crying in parking lots after losing their 10th offer in a row. And the Bank of Canada sat back and watched, because it was focused on protecting the economy from COVID, not on what cheap money was doing to the people who just needed somewhere to live. When it finally acted, raising rates 10 times in little over a year, it overcorrected. The fastest tightening cycle in Canadian history. Prices crashed in some markets. Homeowners who had bought at the peak found themselves underwater. Mortgage renewals became financial emergencies. The Bank of Canada managed to simultaneously inflate the biggest housing bubble in Canadian history and then detonate it. And through all of it, the people who couldn't afford to buy in the first place were still exactly where they started, locked out. The final blow. Into all of this, into a housing market already stretched beyond breaking point, Canada then added one more pressure. The federal government decided to bring in more newcomers per year than at any other point in the country's history. 500,000 permanent residents annually. International students and temporary workers in numbers the country had never seen. Immigration built Canada. That is not in dispute. Newcomers contribute to this country in every way that matters, but there is something that is in dispute, and it is this. Government officials inside the immigration department wrote it down in their own documents before the targets were announced. They said population growth had already exceeded housing supply. They warned that what was being planned would make the housing crisis worse. The warning was written. The targets were set anyway. Every one of those newcomers needed somewhere to live, most of them rented. And the rental market, gutted by decades of underbuilding and investor ownership, had nothing left to give. Rents exploded. In some provinces, nearly 40% in 5 years. People who had lived in the same apartment for a decade opened their renewal letters and felt sick. This is where Canada stands today. The country needs millions of new homes just to restore a basic level of affordability. It is building a fraction of what's required. 6 in 10 Canadians who don't own a home have given up on ever doing so. Not temporarily. Given up. A generation of people who did everything right and discovered the game had already been decided before they arrived. Young Canadians are leaving. Not just their cities, their country. And the economists who study long-term growth have delivered a verdict that should terrify every Canadian politician. Canada's economic growth per person is forecast to be among the worst in the developed world for the next 4 decades, in part because a country that poured all of its investment energy into bidding up the price of existing houses instead of building something new has nothing left to show for it. This is what 30 years of decisions look like when the bill finally comes due. No single government did this. No single party. No single politician you can point at and feel satisfied. This was built across decades by governments of every political stripe through a chain of choices that each seemed defensible in isolation and catastrophic in combination. In 1993, Canada stopped building the homes that working people could actually afford and told the market to handle it. The market handled it the way markets always do, by extracting maximum profit. Cheap money made real estate irresistible as an investment and pushed ordinary buyers out of reach. Zoning laws locked the supply, and homeowners protected their wealth by keeping it that way. Pandemic rates sent prices to levels that had no connection to reality. And then immigration targets were doubled into a system with no capacity to hold them. Each decision fed the next. And the cost has been paid, almost entirely, by people who had no say in any of it. History tells us exactly how to fix this. Canada has done it before. After the Second World War, this country looked at a housing crisis and decided to solve it. With federal money, at scale, with real institutions and clear targets and a government that understood that housing is not a luxury, it is the foundation on which everything else in a person's life is built. That is the only answer history actually supports. Not tweaking mortgage rules, not adjusting zoning at the margins, building, publicly, massively, the way Canada used to. Whether any government finds the courage to do that, that is the open question. But while they deliberate, the nurse, the teacher, and the firefighter are still trying to figure out how to afford a city they've given their lives to. And the clock is running. I'm Malcolm. This is History Meets Economics. If this finally made the housing crisis make sense, share it. Send it to someone who needs to understand how we got here. And if this is your story, if you've been priced out, pushed out, or quietly given up, tell us in the comments. Where are you? What did it cost you? This community is here, and we're listening. Subscribe. There is a lot more history left to unpack. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.